Welcome to episode 3 of the Bait Breakdown, presented by the Tackle Talk podcast, a multi-part series where we take an in-depth look at the 4 major types of a bass's natural forage: baitfish, crawfish, aquatic insects, and reptiles and amphibians. On today's episode, we cover all things aquatic insects with special guest, Dr. Sally Entrekin. Episode 3 of the Bait Breakdown starts right now.
Hello, everybody. I'm Bill Dance, and you're listening to Tackle Talk.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another very special episode of the Tackle Talk podcast, the 3rd episode of our 4-part series, The Bait Breakdown. As always, these 4 conversations will be brought to you with no ad interruptions after we begin the episode, so we do have to thank the folks that made the episodes possible. First and foremost, American Legacy Fishing. ALF is the title sponsor of the Tackle Talk podcast for 4 main reasons. You've heard them before. I'm going to say them again. They are incredible when it comes to their selection of fishing gear that they have on their website. They have extremely fast shipping times. They have the best prices that you will find anywhere, and they have hands down the best customer service in the entire fishing industry. If you're looking for new or used gear, go check out American Legacy Fishing and see for yourself why they have one of the most loyal fan bases in the entire fishing world. If you're looking for anything from G. Loomis, Dobbins, Daiwa, Shimano, 13, Lew's, Megabass, any of those and more, go check out www.americanlegacyfishing.com today. I cannot tell you how much I enjoy interacting with you guys, getting your messages about your first time buying through ALF or your recent experience with ALF. They're all positive. It's all so cool to see. We do special deals through ALF. They give you guys discount codes. There's all kinds of reasons to use ALF and to listen to the show. They're a great partner for us, and they really help save you guys money. So if you haven't, go check them out. Go to www.americanlegacyfishing.com and see for yourself what everyone's raving about. Thank you, as always, to the good folks over at ALF for making this series and the entire podcast possible. All right, let's get into today's episode. Last week, we covered anything and everything crawfish with Dr. Zach Loafman, and now we have crossed off baitfish, and we have crossed off crawfish off of our list, and today we're going to tackle the world of aquatic insects, and we have the pleasure of bringing on aquatic entomologist Dr. Sally Entrekin. We talk with Dr. Entrekin about the wild world of aquatic insects and macroinvertebrates. This means everything from nymphs, mayflies, caddisflies, various stages of larva. We talk about helger mites, all kinds of things that play into the big picture of both bass forage and baitfish forage. So as always with this series, I learned a lot from this episode from talking with Dr. Entrekin, and I'm betting you will too. So let's dive into the wild world of aquatic creepy crawlies. I hope you enjoy it. Here's our conversation with Dr. Sally Entrekin. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are joined today by Dr. Sally Entrekin, Associate Professor specializing in aquatic entomology from Virginia Tech. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Oh, thanks. It's my pleasure to be here.
Cool. So today we're going to dive into the world of aquatic insects, and I'm pretty jacked up because it's probably, not even probably, it's easily the part of a bass's natural forage that I know the least about. So I'm interested to get the chance to pick your brain on this. I feel like I know, at least the basics of craws and baitfish and frogs. I have a pretty good grip on those, but when it comes to bugs, I have no idea. I know what I know from my childhood or know from stomping around in the creeks, but it's really about it. And I know it's probably, anybody listening to this, you can probably agree, we just overlook the smaller things in the ecosystem a lot because we focus so much on big presentations, throwing that big frog, throwing that big swim bait or something like that. But there's so many small kind of intricate parts of a bass's forage that we just, we tend to slight a little bit and we tend to overlook. So before we dive into this, how did you decide to specialize in aquatic entomology? I have to assume there's some sort of history or experience along the way that kind of led you down that path.
Yeah, it's not often that kids grow up saying, okay, I'm going to be an aquatic ecologist, unless that's what their parents or some of their friends do for a living. I, like you, grew up stomping around in the creek in the backyard. My mom would throw us out of the house on the weekends, and we didn't have anything else to do but go down the creek and collect whatever's in there. And that included aquatic insects. I then had a professor as an undergraduate in Georgia at Georgia Southwestern State University who said, are you interested in identifying aquatic invertebrates for me for a special project? for Lake Blackshear. And I said, sure, that would be great. So that was my start. And so like many of you, I had a great undergraduate mentor that got me started, and I just fell in love with them because they're so beautiful. And I went on to graduate school to study their production and ecology in South Georgia at the Jones Center in freshwater wetlands, and then on to streams and rivers throughout the southeastern United States and up into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where we were, for my PhD, we were specifically trying to increase the aquatic insect biomass and their production so that we could increase the number of trout in that stream. So I've always, I guess most of the time, these studies are interested in connecting the aquatic insects and who's there and how much of them are there to support the higher trophic levels or feeding levels, which are fish.
So you mentioned a word there that I didn't even know until probably about a year ago, biomass. So we learned a little bit about that on a couple episodes last year, where, at least the way I understand it, I think, is like a certain body of water can hold or sustain a certain amount of life. Like just with its natural resources and everything, it can hold so many pounds of something, or, so many this per acre. It sounded like, at least when we dove into it, it's very, very tough to kind of up biomass. It seems to be a natural thing that it's just it's tough to get something to produce more than it's naturally allowed to. So what were you guys doing to try and increase biomass in certain bodies of water when it comes, because we hear about it sometimes for bait fish or for predatory fish, but on the insect side too?
Yeah. So fisheries management, this is a really important thing to be able to predict, is how much fish biomass can you yield? Just like if you're planting corn in a row crop agricultural system. So if you think about an agricultural system with corn, what are the things that you do in order to increase the biomass or the yield of the corn? And so you have to have food for the corn. And in most cases, what's limiting the amount of biomass there is nitrogen and phosphorus, which is why you apply the fertilizer. In our case, it's going to be some type of carbon resource. And so you have to think about, well, what do the bugs eat? There really aren't many options for the bugs. It's going to be leaves that fall into the stream, and it's going to be algae that's produced in the stream. So that's what we were trying to do, is we add large wood, old dead pieces of wood to the stream that collect and hold the leaves that fall into the stream. And from there, if you have more energy and nutrients that are encapsulated in those leaves, it should support a greater biomass of insects, and then subsequently a greater biomass of your fishes. Did you find that you were able to up that at all with your study? We did in one stream. We had 3 different streams. And in one stream, because of some differences, we think in other characteristics like the bottom composition of the stream, coupled with that added leaf litter that was retained by the wood, we did see an increase in the biomass of the insects. See, that's interesting. It's stuff I would never even think about, but you're right. I'm thinking of a couple rivers and a couple little creeks that we have around here, and the ones that obviously when you're in there stomping around or you're fishing or you're wading or something, you're running into a lot more bugs and stuff in the water on those ones that obviously have overhanging trees that have, like you said, because that makes sense. That's their food source. So if you've got overhanging trees versus a farm creek that's out in the middle of nowhere, those a lot of times is where I attribute dead water to, is when you're just out in the middle of absolute nowhere. It's just runoff and there's no trees, there's no vegetation, there's no nothing. And you're right, there's less bugs, there's less bait fish, there's less predatory fish. So it kind of makes sense. It's little stuff that I probably would never even think of as like, oh, the trees, yeah, bass don't eat trees, but bass eat bugs that eat trees. So we probably need to put together that equation a little bit better. So it's interesting. So starting in my knowledge of where I'm starting here, I don't know too much about aquatic insects at all. I'd say probably the first interaction I had with aquatic insects, kind of like you hinted at earlier, would be, 7, 8 years old, you're stomping around in a creek. I turned over an old, what was it, probably a brick, and I took this giant long worm up to my grandpa. I was like, look what I found in the creek. He's like, yeah, I probably wouldn't play with those. That's just a giant leech. Like, I would probably let that go. So so it's interesting to think about too, and we'll probably get to this a little bit later, but the just absolute diversity of aquatic insects that you have in a certain body of water, because you do have little microscopic
microscopic things that we, probably wouldn't even notice or see versus, you've got helger mites, you've got big leeches, you've got all kinds of stuff that are going to a couple inches long. So how do you collect sample? Probably seine netting, I'm assuming, is a big thing you guys do?
We do a lot of different things. Aquatic insects are the most diverse, or insects in general, the most diverse animals. And to collect them, it means you have to have lots of different types of gear, just like you do with fishes, because you have all these different species with all these different habitat requirements and specializations. So seines we usually don't use because they're too big and they're too coarse. So you would miss most things. So we go in and if we're in a stream, we want to just sample one area. We put it looks like a pot with the bottom cut out. But it has mesh sides, and that's called a Hess sampler. So we would sample a very discrete area, and exacerbate, agitate the substrate, and let the water do its job to wash the bugs into the nets. If we're working in a lake, it's the best because you get to go out on a boat. It's called a dredge, and it looks like the jaws of death. That it's like some type of like a bulldozer or something that just has these jaws that scoops up the soft substrate at the bottom of a lake or a big river like the Mississippi River, and you have to bring it up with a hand crank.
Oh my goodness! So then, before we, I guess, dive into the meat of this, have you ever found anything weird in anything like that? Have you just pulled up something where you're like, oh, that's not what we were going for? Because I can assume around here, like, again, I'm not fishing or wading or something in the best areas sometimes. I would be scared what you would find if you dredged or pulled up some areas around here. Have you found anything weird or maybe a species that didn't belong where you were or something like that?
I think one of the most interesting finds was we were out in an urban creek in central Arkansas, and we found a tilapia. And I guess the other interesting thing I found that was from the land use past was a silver cup. It was a camp cup from the Conservation Corps. One of the sites that we worked on was a CCC camp from the 1930s where they were mining. And it was just somebody's old camp cup that got thrown into the creek and
been there for Lord knows how long, never touched. And
yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Well, I guess to set the stage here, big question before I dive into a lot of my other questions. Is it safe to say that aquatic insects make up at least part of a bass's or a predatory fish's natural diet, most bodies of water in the United States?
Yes, definitely. I'm thinking about some of the studies up in Wisconsin, in the natural lakes where they've done a lot of bass gut content analysis, and they are a mixture of other fishes and usually pretty large macroinvertebrates. We call them macroinvertebrates. It means that they're visible with the naked eye.
Okay.
That's just a jargon.
Got it. Macroinvertebrates. Good to know. So I'm glad that was the answer to that question too, because otherwise this episode would probably be pretty short. So I'm glad they make up part of the natural forage. So to start out, I guess like bug 101 for me, dumb bass guy right here that just doesn't spend a whole lot of time studying insects. I think if you're talking to a fly angler or a fly fisherman, you probably know a little bit more about the macroinvertebrates like you're talking about, or the aquatic insects because they imitate them a lot more with the way that they fish. But are there just certain common insects that we need to be aware of, like your starter insects, I guess? Like if we're looking at, the bird kingdom, not the bald eagle, but like the robin or the crow of aquatic insects. Are there certain ones that we just probably need to be familiar with, like the most common ones?
Well, yeah. I mean, the most common macroinvertebrate aquatic insect is that you'll come across as a fisherman will probably be the chironomid midges. They're a type of fly, and they're non-biting midges that reach extremely high biomasses. They're small as individuals, but collectively, they usually make up the greatest amount of biomass in either flowing water or in stagnant or non-flowing water.
Are those found everywhere in the United States, or are they pretty regional?
Everywhere.
Okay.
Everywhere. No matter where you go, there they are. They are very tolerant to high dissolved or low dissolved oxygen, high temperatures. They can be found in geothermal pools. So they're everywhere. They're ubiquitous.
Okay. Are there any others that are, because I have to imagine a lot of these insects or macroinvertebrates are, some of them have to be regional, right? Just the water temp, the ecosystem. I would assume that you go to the Pacific Northwest or you go down to Florida, you're going to find very different things in your creeks or your rivers or your ponds. Are there other ones other than these midges that just across the board are going to be found in the lower 48?
So one thing that's really different between fish identification and fish distributions and insects is you really tend to have a core group of aquatic insects found no matter where you go. If I go down to Argentina, where we're at the, we're geographically very distant, but the environmental conditions of the stream are the same, we're probably going to find the same families of aquatic invertebrates, a certain kind of family of mayfly, dragonfly, stonefly, it goes on and on. Because we can't identify aquatic insects at the species level, because you have to have the adult form and usually the male, we often don't even know what species are there. So really the most important separation when you're looking at aquatic insects is not so much geographic distribution, but it's habitat, whether it's flowing or non-flowing. That's the big separation.
Got it. So then let's go to flowing or non-flowing. Are there certain, because again, I'm thinking immediately of like, fast moving little streams is where I think just the insects are visible enough that I've noticed them versus other places. You've got a smaller area to survey there. Are there certain types of insect or macroinvertebrates or something that just absolutely thrive in moving water and would do very poorly in stagnant water versus the opposite?
Yeah, you can remember the EPT taxa. That's an important distinction. You get a lot of EPT taxa in high oxygen, pretty cool mountain or forested streams. Those are the ephemeropterans, those are mayflies. The plecopterans are the stoneflies, and the trichopterans are the caddisflies. That's not to say you don't get them in non-flowing water, but they're much more diverse in flowing water, and they can be found in all different habitats, whether it's in a riffle where you've got lots of turbulence or in a pool that's barely flowing at all. You'll be able to find representatives of each one of those orders in high abundance. And those are what are used to indicate the quality of the water from a biological assessment standpoint. And this is this biological assessment is critical for regulating the quality of flowing waters by the federal and state governments.
So because a lot of these, I have to assume anyway, a lot of these things that we're talking about are so beholden to the current and, they don't have really the strength to fight the current a lot of times. They're just kind of there with the thing. You're saying that, if you go to an eddy or you go to a fast-moving part or a riffle or something, you're going to find the exact same things. There's no, because again, I'm thinking just with my fish brain that, the eddies are where you're going to find, certain predatory fish right on the edge waiting for these things to be flown down. But then you're saying no matter where you sample in a river or in a creek, you should, at least for the most part, find the same makeup in different parts of that same river. If you go, up a mile where the water's a little bit faster, you go down where it's a little bit more pooled, you should find pretty much the same thing?
Well, so we're working on much smaller scale. So if you take like a 100 meter reach of a length of a stream,
okay,
and you've got a riffle where there's lots of turbulence, and then you've got a run where there's just a smooth flowing water, and then you've got a pool where there's not much flow, you always have the EPT taxa, but you have different representatives. So in really high flowing water, you have net spinning caddisflies or water pennies. That's a beetle larvae, and they cling. They're called clingers, and they're adapted to staying in place under really high flows. Whereas if you go into a pool, you're going to find things that crawl around, and it'll just be you can still have caddisflies, but now you have case caddisflies that they use silk glands to make a shelter, and they walk around with these shelters. I think they're partly to protect them from predation, and partly they help them to pump water through their case so that if dissolved oxygen levels get too low in those pools, they can kind of help increase the amount of available oxygen. So at the genus level, there is definitely differences in the composition of the aquatic invertebrates at the riffle versus the run versus the pool.
Got it. How much does water temperature, because again, I'm thinking of all the variables that I always think of when I go out on the water. I have to assume some of these probably apply and some of them don't. What does water temperature do to the makeup of aquatic insects? And, even I'm thinking in different parts of a river, around here, the water temp of, thinking of one of our rivers in general, 20 miles up could be degrees different than what it is down here. What does water temp do to these macroinvertebrates and these insects?
Well, temperature is really important, just like flow. So the aquatic insects really have very specific thresholds for the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water and the temperature. And the warmer the water, the less dissolved oxygen is in the water. That's just physics. So cooler water holds more dissolved oxygen. So when the water rises and the dissolved oxygen lowers, then you're going to lose some of the stoneflies. We have some stonefly species like the giant stonefly, Pteronarces is the genus name, but it's called the salmon fly. And it will no longer be able to live in conditions when the temperature gets too warm. So things like damming is really, or even pulling water and reducing water levels and reducing the amount of turbulence from lower water levels will eliminate the Pteronarces, the giant stoneflies, from these small streams.
What about weather or climate, or are there any other, outside factors that can determine what these aquatic insects are doing at any given time? So like how active they are or how dormant they go? Is it like, because I know there's some schools of thought with fish for barometric pressure, and when things get unstable, fish start to feed a little bit more. Does any of that apply to the aquatic insect world?
Yeah, that's a great question. Aquatic insects, and especially the stoneflies, mayflies, and caddisflies, the EPT, those tend to be the more charismatic, but they're also really abundant and important fish food in flowing waters. And they tend to be as larvae, which is when the aquatic insects that we study are usually in their larval form, and they're terrestrial, so they're winged adults. So they're usually larvae from October up until March or April, and then they emerge, mate, and lay their eggs in sometime in the summer. And those eggs might diapause. They may be able to resist drying out if you get really low summer flows. So the most active time for most of our aquatic insects, aside from the beetles and the fly larvae, is that fall winter period.
Okay, because I've heard I started to fish some water that a lot of times gets fished by fly anglers, and you start to pick up some of this terminology where they're talking about like the mayfly hatch or something like that. So when they're talking about the hatch, because you made a good point too that these are winged insects, so a lot of the things that's probably important to us as anglers are when they are subsurface and when they're not, flying away, because at that point they're less of a part of the ecosystem for a fish. So unless they hit the water and then you come up on top water, but so when the hatch happens, when they're talking about the hatch, does that mean going from egg to larva, or from larva to winged insect and gone, and then those are just kind of at the top of the water column and they get eaten? What does the hatch mean?
That's a really great question. So when you go from egg to larva, what you have in flowing waters is a lot of drift. So in aquatic insects, when they're babies, it's hard for them to hang on because they don't have their nets made, or they don't have their case made, and they're really small. So that's one period of time when they're susceptible to being eaten by fish, when they're just drifting downstream. But then the other time is a lot of times it takes them about a year to go from their first larval, we call it instar, to their final one. And then in that final one, they'll usually come up to the top of the water, or go crawl out onto the banks, or try to find some refuge, and then they'll metamorphose into a full winged adult. It's that period of time that anglers are typically considering. And some, like mayflies, they emerge together. It's amazing that really temperature alone, the average temperature over the year predicts when they're going to emerge, and they all do it together. And so it's this massive emergence that can be seen on radar if you're in a big river or in a lake.
Holy moly. Okay, so are there any, because I know, again, I've heard about the mayfly and stuff like that. Are the hatches for other species around that same time, or is every species different where it's like, hey, I hatch, 2 or 3 weeks before this species or 2 or 3 weeks after these species? You kind of hinted that temperature can play a role in that. Is there just a natural order of what comes first?
It's hard to talk about species when we talk about insects because we have so much diversity. So I can't tell you at the species level, but there are a lot of families within the order Ephemeropteran, which are the mayflies, that do have this emergence, this mass emergence at about the same time, but not all of them do. I would say every water body has some taxa. Well, we say taxa instead of species that emerge en masse in synchrony, but there's no one big group like a mayfly or stonefly that always emerge en masse. But one of the best examples of I guess, synchronous emergence or hatching, it's really not hatching. I think when the anglers are saying hatching, what they mean is going from the larvae to the...
Yeah, we have our own... we don't use the right terms a lot of times.
The jargon kills all of us. But burrowing mayflies that are in lakes and big rivers, they emerge en masse, and it's very predictable by temperature, can be seen on radar. And another are the chironomid midges. There are some taxa of midges that are also such large emergences that they can be seen on radar. But if you pay attention while you're out there, whenever you see, we call them bugnados, look for there's little bugnados and there's big bugnados. And usually those are either mayflies or there's some sort of fly or gnat.
Got it. What about the life cycle of some of these things? You mentioned something a minute ago, like annual. What does the life cycle of a lot of these bugs look like? Is it just completely annual, season to season, or do some? Because you hear stories of like, a butterfly lives 14 days or something like that. What is the lifespan of a lot of these aquatic insects, or does it just vary so widely that you almost can't even generalize it?
No, you can generalize some. Most of them are what we call univoltine, or one. It takes them 1 year to complete their entire life cycle.
Okay.
I think I can say this, that all aquatic insects larval stage when they're in the water is longer than when they're adults.
Okay.
And because a lot of adults don't even feed. There are examples like with the dragonflies, where the larvae can live 2 or 3 years, and then they still only have a month or two as adults. And then there are some flies that, like black flies or chironomids or mosquitoes, that can complete their whole life cycle within a few weeks, especially when it's warm, which is what makes them, problematic when they're also carrying diseases around.
Got it. So when you say when they're in like their larvae stage, what does the profile of a aquatic insect in the larvae stage look like or resemble? Because I'm thinking back to like when I was in like second or third grade, we had, what were they, mealworms, I think, where we watched basically it go from worm to pupa or larva or whatever to beetle, and you watch this thing, and in that middle stage it looked like a cocoon, or it looked like a just kind of some weird little wrapped up thing. Is that what a lot of these are in their larva stage, or is it completely different where they're just an aquatic bug and then they're going to go to a bug with wings?
Well, we can break the aquatic insects into those that have what we call incomplete metamorphosis and those that have complete. So complete metamorphosis is a butterfly. You have an egg, a larval stage, they pupate and it looks like a cocoon. They totally rearrange their body to have wings, and then they emerge as winged adults. But the other half, we call them the more primitive insects. That includes the mayflies and the dragonflies and the stoneflies. They go from egg to larvae, which is also called a nymph. And
Okay.
while they're being larvae and eating, their body is transitioning into an adult stage at the same time. And they develop wing pads. So you can see their wing pads. And then they split open their body and then they emerge as winged adults, which is unbelievable.
Yeah, that's wild. Okay, so because a lot of times when I think of larvae, pupa, stuff like that, I tend to group all of that together, like the middle stage of something's life where it's going from A to B. But it sounds like with a lot of these insects, you don't even necessarily, if you picked one up, you wouldn't realize that it's in that metamorphosis stage, right? It would just kind of look like a normal bug or a normal thing.
Yeah, I guess if you're comparing it to a butterfly, which is, I think, the best example, the caterpillar, and if it has complete metamorphosis, if it's like a beetle or a fly or a trichopter and a caddisfly, then it's going to look sort of like a caterpillar and then it's going to go into a pupal stage that looks like a cocoon and emerges an adult. But if it's the others, the dragonfly, the mayfly, or the stonefly, it'll sort of look like a caterpillar, except it has well-developed legs, three pairs of well-developed legs, and then wing pads that look like little nubby wings. And
it's not
so
fully grown yet. Yeah.
Yeah. So they look much different from a caterpillar.
That's wild. So I guess for angler side, that's the time of this lifespan that we need to be targeting, which would be, they are going from, because you mentioned nymph too, so that was something I was going to ask. It sounds like that's just across the board the same thing as this bug going through the transition phase.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is. It's that larval stage when they molt. That's a characteristic of all insects, is they molt. So as they grow, they shed their exoskeleton. They have a chitinous exoskeleton. And once they start into their final molts, then they start to develop these adult features. And you can see that on their bodies. And yes, they're bigger, and that would be the preferred fish food.
Got it. What about just because on one hand, I can think of like our big stagnant state park lakes that I'm thinking of where I really don't see a ton of bug or aquatic insect activity. It's just, it's hot, it's stagnant. Yeah, if you go back like in the coves or something where there's a lot of tree cover or something, you're going to see it. But just out in the open water, out there in the middle of a lake, is there still a lot of aquatic insect activity? Or, do we just miss it because it's deeper, because we don't have a chance to see it? Or is a lot of that activity really kind of a little bit more active as you go to the shallower parts, as you go to the feeder creeks and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it can depend some on whether or not it's a natural lake or, glacial lake, or if it's a reservoir, it's a dammed river where that was never meant to be flooded.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what you're talking about, the reservoirs. And the middle of a reservoir will have chironomid midges. I've talked about those, and they're the bloodworms. So you've probably seen bloodworms. They're maybe an inch, or if you're lucky, 2 inches long, and they're bright red because they've got hemoglobin pigment that binds oxygen under low oxygen conditions. So then when the water really is super stagnant in July or August, they can still breathe. So you'll definitely find a ton of them, and they are really important as fish food. The second thing that you find are burrowing mayflies, and burrowing mayflies can be quite large, and they've got these, they look like mole crickets. If you've ever seen a mole cricket, they've got legs, or mole legs, the way that they're adapted for digging. And then they've got these feathery gills. And so they dig into the bottom of the lake substrate and the sediment, and they make these big U-shaped burrows, and they're in those burrows, and they just they pulsate so that the water flows through their burrow, and they can get oxygen flowing over their gills. And they have so many gills that it really helps them be efficient with the little oxygen that's there. And they can, like I said, they can be really dense. I've seen them create really large mass emergences here in Virginia at one of our reservoirs. that also goes stagnant. So chironomids and burrowing mayflies are there. Now, one thing to think about is not just what's on the bottom of the water when you're working in non-flowing water, it's also what's in the water column. So you probably know zooplankton. Yeah. So Cladocera and Daphnia, I don't even know what their common names are. Copepods, teeny tiny, but there's also an insect in there. It's a chaabrid. It's a phantom midge fly, and it's translucent. It looks like it came out of the deep depths of the ocean, and it's got this like long gizzard looking thing, and it's got hairs coming off of its head, and it uses for filtering the zooplankton, but it's also a really important food for fish because it's much bigger than your zooplankton.
Well, and even some of these smaller things like zooplankton that we think of in the bass food chain, because while, yes, that 7-pound fish that we're after may not be just going to town on the zooplankton buffet, the fish that it's eating are. So a lot of times we follow that kind of stuff too, where that's where wind direction stuff makes a big difference, because you're pushing all of those microorganisms to one side of the lake. The bait fish follow, the predatory fish follow. So again, all of that, whether it's big enough or not to be consumed or to be a big deal for the fish that we're after in the end, it determines where we're targeting a lot of times, because obviously you just follow the food source. So that's interesting to think of too. So the other caveat, I guess, in this is that a lot of the big lakes and stuff that I'm thinking of around here, we have a lot of flood control lakes. So kind of like you said, like reservoirs, but you have a lot of these, a big river or, a big moving water source that's feeding this thing. So especially this time of year, I mean, we flood like crazy. So I have to assume that a lot of everything that's in that feeder creek or in that smaller creek gets dumped into that big lake at some point. It's just a matter of where do they go from there, or do they just kind of go with the current and get swept down the rest of the dam and they go down through the rest of the river system. So it's kind of interesting to see. So it sounds like, I guess, if they get stuck in there, if they have to find an area of the lake that's conducive to what they are. So if they're not one of the two things you talked about that's going to be in the deep water, they're finding their way to the shallower water, or just getting sucked out, I guess, at some point.
Yeah, they can't live in the deep water.
Yeah, okay.
And if there's enough flow along, we call the littoral zone, or the vegetated shallow area around the reservoir, they may be able to live there if the dissolved oxygen levels remains high, but it's just not their habitat.
Got it. So a lot of those, I think, probably it's more of a flush. They're coming into the lake for a little period of time and they're getting taken right out the dam.
Yeah.
Got it. So one thing I wanted to touch on too, because around here we have a lot of farm land, a lot of runoff, a lot of this kind of stuff that I think can I'm assuming make a difference for what's going on in the creeks and the rivers and things like that. I know obviously we've talked about fish kills around here with pesticides and stuff like that. Does that trickle down to aquatic insects as well?
Yes. I guess you see fish kills, usually it's from dissolved oxygen that just plummets. And that's in response to algae blooms that suck up all the oxygen from the water. So we don't see, it's not common to see mass die-offs of all aquatic insects, because so many of them are adapted to changes in the conditions of the water. So, for example, the mayfly, stoneflies, and caddisflies I talked to you about that are so sensitive to dissolved oxygen and temperature, that's where you see die-offs. And that's why regulatory agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency uses the proportion of those specific taxa to indicate the water quality. And they don't use beetles and they don't use flies, because those taxa tend to be more adapted to the conditions that may be affected by fertilizer use or pesticide use. Not always, but I think we can generalize.
What about some of the bigger things that I guess we see a lot more often? So I know there, like I said, we've talked about some species or some, I'm using the word species wrong. I know I am. The the family or the order or whatever it is that what we're talking about. There are some bigger ones that we as anglers can get our eyes on. So there's helger mites are a big thing around here, or a big food source, especially for smallmouth bass. We imitate those a lot with some of the lures that we do. Do things like that are that big, do they go through the same processes as some of their smaller counterparts, or is that basically just that? I don't know anything about helger mites. Does that helger mite stay that way its entire time, or is that a certain part of its lifespan?
The helger mite has, I think, arguably the most interesting life cycle. So you know that if you look up on a bridge, you're under a bridge and you look up, you see white spots. It looks like bird poop. Have you ever noticed that? And that's helger mite egg masses. So they lay their eggs under bridges or on the undersides of, a lot of times, sycamore leaves, any tree that's growing along the edge of the stream. So they'll lay their eggs so that the eggs, once they hatch, the larvae fall directly into the water. And then the larvae like to live in cobbles and gravel. So pretty high quality stream bed with flowing water. They're predators. So they eat a lot of chironomid midges. And then when they're ready to pupate, because they have complete metamorphosis like a moth or a butterfly, they go from the water to the edge of the stream, out of the stream. They crawl out as a larvae. And then they dig this, like I tell my students, it's like a coffin. They dig their own coffin, except it's not to die. It's to transition into an adult. But usually it's under a rock or a log or an old case of beer that's been left, the cardboard. If it's wet and you lift any piece of debris, you'll probably see these helger mite pupal coffins. And that's where they spend a few weeks transitioning. And then they emerge as these beautiful adults with extremely large mandibles. You've probably seen them. I mean, but they don't feed. The only reason they have those spectacular mandibles is for attracting a mate and holding a mate. So the males have the larger mandibles for
so you can actually grasp,
mobilizing the female. Yeah.
I'll be darned. Because, those are one of those things where you look at the very first time you see it, you're like, I am not messing with that thing. But they're really cool once you get up to them and you play with them. And again, they're big enough that I think we as bass guys can wrap our head around imitating that as an actual forage. So we'll, take a little Ned rig and they make, soft plastic helger mites that you actually use and you imitate them. So stuff like that is interesting. Lately, the past couple of years, we've seen a lot more imitations of like dragonflies come out, like topwater dragonflies, where you'll get them to come up and actually eat on the surface. Stuff like that and obviously leeches, you can see bigger things in the ecosystem. Is there anything, on the topic of leeches, I guess, is there anything when you're walking through the water, like that you guys know or that you guys observe through your studies, where it's like, okay, that is one bug or one thing that as a human you probably wouldn't mess with because it can actually hurt you? Like, I think there's this weird thing of, you look at bugs, you have all these people that are so scared of bugs on, you see them on dry land, but then you look at pictures of bugs in water and they're like, oh, that thing's cool looking, it's kind of cute. I think it's because they know it's in the water and it's not going to sneak up on them, or they're not going to step on it on dry land. Is there anything that as anglers maybe we're wet wading or something that we should know about and be like, all right, probably watch out for this?
No,
nice.
There's not. If you've ever been pinched by a crayfish, there's nothing like crayfish that will pinch you and make you cry when they get between your fingers. And the only thing that I tend to be very respectful of are the giant water bugs. They're hemipterans. They're true bugs. So they're like the aphids that suck. They have a beak and they tap into the stem of a plant and suck their sap. Well, we have aquatic counterparts that tap into other aquatic insects and even fishes. And so the giant giant water bugs can capture a small fish, inject its beak, it injects a digestive enzyme, and then it sucks its guts out. So I've never had the guts sucked out of me, because I know how to pick them up. Just like if you play with crawfish or crawdads, you know how to pick them up so you don't get pinched. So that would be the only thing that I would say. Anything with a beak that can pierce your skin and digest your tissue I'd steer clear of.
I can't be thinking of the same water bugs. The same water bug I'm thinking of are like, we call them like water spiders or whatever, just those big things. Is that what you're talking about? Like those things that have...
They're related.
I was about to say.
They are related. Okay. So those are the water striders that you're talking about. And they have a beak too, and they're predators. And that's what they do, is they capture other aquatic insects and they pierce them and suck their guts. But their beak is so small that it doesn't hurt us. There's also water boatmen that you'll see them darting on the surface of the water, and they dive down and they dart up. They're black and white with red eyes. They're kind of colorful, and they also they feed the same way. And I've been bitten by those, and it stings, but I don't think it's anything that you need to be worried about.
Got it. So just check your feet for leeches afterwards and you're good to go.
That's right.
Cool. Well, we'll wrap this up with a couple questions that might be able to tie this back to bass fishing just a little bit. So I know at the beginning of the episode you said, yes, these aquatic insects that we spent time talking about do make up part of basically probably any predatory fish's natural forage. What role do you think aquatic insects or macroinvertebrates or whatever play in, I guess, the day-to-day life of, say, an American black bass, so largemouth, smallmouth, spotted bass? Do you think they make up a substantial part of their daily diet, or do you think it's just one of those things that's like, yeah, maybe every once in a while when one presents itself?
Well, I think it's important to think about, I think the bass eat a lot of other small fishes. So the small fishes absolutely rely on the aquatic insects. So from that standpoint, there are no bass without aquatic insects. And then I guess thinking about these reservoir systems, the burrowing mayflies and the chironomids have such high biomass that those are also going to be critical food resources. And I don't know what the proportion is, and I'm sure it depends on where you are, but just the fact that every fish in some way, unless it eats algae, is reliant on aquatic insects. They're critical to the food web.
And then I guess last question here to just kind of oversimplify. I know we kind of hit it a little bit, but if you are listening to this and you're a bass angler, is there a certain like calendar time of year where you should say, hey, above all else, maybe this time of year you should probably take into consideration aquatic insect activity or, what they're doing versus maybe other times of the year? Is there just a certain time? Is it spring? Is it fall where you're like, hey, pay attention a little bit more to aquatic insects this time of year than others?
It's going to be March, April, May. That's when they're going from the larvae to the adult stage. So they're vulnerable and they're active in the water column. And that's when the fish will see them. That's when they're most likely to be feeding on them.
Got it. Springtime, pay attention to your bugs, learn a little bit. Don't overlook them in the bass's ecosystem, because whether it's the bass eating it, whether it's the baitfish eating it and the bass following, they do play an important part of this food system, this food chain, and the food pyramid that we're going to talk about throughout this series. So thank you so much. I know you're busy. I know we got to let you go. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us. And if people want to catch up, I guess, with what you're doing research-wise or, anything aquatic entomology, where would you direct them to take a look and kind of, if they're interested in learning a little bit more?
Yeah, I'm at Virginia Tech. So just Sally at Virginia Tech will lead you to my webpage and my email. And I'm always happy to get emails or phone calls from anyone who wants to talk more about aquatic insects and send pictures. So don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Awesome. Well, that is Dr. Sally Entrekin. Sally, thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us today.
Thanks, Andrew. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate the opportunity.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to episode 3 of the Bait Breakdown, the Aquatic Insects episode with Dr. Sally Entrekin. Get ready, next week we wrap up the Bait Breakdown with episode 4 on reptiles and amphibians with herpetologist Dr. Matt Cross. As always, thank you guys so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. That helps a ton. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, wherever you listen to podcasts. And we will see you right back here next week for episode 4 of the Bait Breakdown here on the Tackle Talk podcast.